Hello and welcome to this working lunch, which we've called Appetite for Production because it's lunchtime and because we're creating cheesy jokes. It's a huge privilege to welcome Katrina Campbell, Chris Jones and Richard Baister to talk with me about global food supply chains and food security. Katrina is a professor of food security and diagnostics at the Institute for Global Food Security at Queen's University in Belfast. Chris is the lead for research and design for Feeding Cities, and Richard Baister is the founder and CEO of SoPro protein water and Brainwave brands, but also Sumo drinks. So hugely privileged to have you. And I'll just make a few points here at the start, because from where I sit as a trade economist, there are a few things which are really starting to come up to the surface in the area of global trade. And the first is this: at the start of the pandemic, the president of the Afrexim Bank, which is a huge export-import bank, suggested that it wouldn't be COVID that killed Africans. It would be that the fact that food supply chains would be disrupted, and that many Africans wouldn't be able to afford to work from home. So they would actually intrinsically have to go to work, they'd be more likely to get COVID, and therefore intrinsically at risk because they wouldn't be accessing food and wouldn't be accessing health care more generally. And in the end, we actually saw some really big innovations through the pandemic to make sure that food got to the right places in Africa. But it didn't mean that Africa got through the pandemic well in terms of its food security. And we've seen some estimates put out by the UNDP suggesting around 30 million people across Africa have actually been pushed into food poverty as a result of the COVID pandemic. So I mean, it raises a big issue for us, doesn't it, about food security in emerging economies, but also food security in the developed world as well, because we're seeing supply chain shortages, we're seeing a big issue around trade, and food security is, if it's fundamentally about worldwide access to sufficient and nutritious and safe foods, meeting preferences and dietary needs, whatever that means, in ways that the planet can sustain. What we're beginning to look at now is a situation where the food security of the world is perhaps not sustainable anymore, partly caused by the pandemic, partly caused by climate change, and partly caused by innovations perhaps not happening quickly enough. So Katrina, maybe I could start with you because this is absolutely your background. Can you pick up for me on some of those issues around food security and how we can start to make our food more secure? Is there something that we can do quickly? What has COP26 taught us about how we need to regulate for all of this? Is there something we can do quickly, do you think, or is this something that's going to take a while?
I think it's something that we need to address now to put proper infrastructure into place. And when we define food security, as the United Nations, to have that physical, social and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food that meets food choices and dietary needs to an active and healthy life. There's a further caveat that needs to be added there in terms of just by ethical means, whereby we remove child slavery and poverty in the actual producers producing our food. Even before COVID, there were numerous reports that by 2050, with the global population heading to 9.5 billion, that we would need to produce in the next 50 years as much food as we had produced in the last 500 years. Food security by 2050 was always going to be a concern. And, there's a number of innovations have been put in place. But there's also other mechanisms that have come into place then because of COVID. A little bit of Amazonization has happened in terms of Amazon being able to fulfill the needs of sales at home. But on the controversy of that, though, it has also been reported that the planet produces enough food, and it is how this food is produced, distributed and wasted which means that we have food insecurity in many regions of the world, and whereby we should be thinking more of that circular economy from your environment right through to waste and back into the environment in a food production chain, to actually alleviate some of these problems in food production or insufficient amounts of food. And when we look at the different populations of the world, they're all undergoing food insecurity in some shape or form. And this is, of course, often worse, as you indicated, in developing regions compared to developed regions. But even within the developed world, we are witnessing large socioeconomic differences in the population, and whereby children are going to bed hungry because food has become unaffordable to these families. And perhaps a question that could be asked is, are we living beyond our means in other ways, sacrificing the requirement of other items for food? And, you know, an increasing number of countries are facing growing levels of acute food insecurity, reversing years of development gains. And even before COVID, reduced incomes, disrupted supply chains, chronic and acute hunger were on the rise due to various factors, including conflict, socioeconomic conditions, natural hazards, climate change, and pests. And COVID-19 impacts have led to severe and widespread increases in global food insecurity, affecting vulnerable households in almost every country, with impacts expected to go into 2022 and possibly beyond. And the primary risks to food security are at the country level. Higher retail prices combined with reduced incomes mean more and more households are having to cut down on the quantity and quality of the food they consume. And numerous countries are experiencing very high food price inflation at the retail level, reflecting some of the lingering supply disruptions due to COVID, social distancing measures, currency devaluations, and other factors. And rising food prices have a greater impact on people in low and middle income countries, since they spend a larger share of their income on food than people in high income countries. And just one last paragraph and some statistics to finish. Between 720 and 811 million people in the world went hungry in 2020, according to United Nations report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world. And looking at the middle of the projected range, around 768 million, around 118 million people were facing chronic hunger in 2020 than in 2019. And using a different indicator that tracks year-round access to adequate food, nearly 2.37 billion people, or 30% of the global population, lacked access to adequate food in 2020. And this was really a rise in 320 million in just 1 year. And the pandemic, of course, of COVID-19 really had an impact on that as well.
What you've done, Katrina, and really thank you for that, because it's really put everything in a global perspective. What you're basically saying is everything is interdependent. So the current economic climate, the post-COVID environment that we're all operating in, the supply chain shortages, rising prices, and they're creating, and you know, not just rising prices, but also climate change itself. So rising temperatures. Then on the flip side of all of that, creating difficulties, you've also got other issues around public health, like obesity and access to inappropriate food, which is causing all of these problems. So where do we go from here? I mean, what do we all say we have to do something quickly, but how do we do something quickly without making the situation worse? I mean, there are a lot of people saying if we move tomorrow out of coal, then it renders a whole load of people without access to fuel or energy or livelihood. So we have to transition. So what can we prioritize in this space?
You know, in relation to food security, you know, food has really now moved to globalisation. And, you know, the COVID pandemic has provided us with many lessons, including the fact that we are not truly equipped to deal with such events at scale or at the capacity of COVID. And I'm trying to avoid being the grim reaper, but just imagine if the severity of infection had have been worse with higher death rates for all generations. So even our children being highly affected by COVID, none of our systems would have been able to cope. What we learned in COVID-19 was that the pandemic placed unprecedented stresses on food supply chains with bottlenecks in farm labour, processing, transport and logistics, as well as monumental shifts in demand to foods with longer shelf life. And most of these disruptions, of course, were a result of policies adopted to contain the spread of the virus. But I think we have to look at those globalisation of supply chains. And even back in the 2008 economic crisis, many politicians questioned the merits of globalisation. And of course, with the rising living standards in the emerging markets and developing countries, it's also a critical element in achieving sustainable growth for the economy. So for the globalisation, that's not a new phenomenon. That's been around for a long time. But what COVID has shown is that we are highly reliant on this system, and whereby we should be looking back to more local based systems and having seasonal products compared to having products all year round. And this shortening of supply chains is one area that could be addressed very much so moving forward, for sustainability.
So, I mean, Chris, do come in on this, and everyone do feel free to chip in and make conversations. This is ask questions. This is a working lunch. But Chris, I guess my question to you: this is more than the Marcus Rashford thing, isn't it? It's more than Marcus Rashford can deal with single-handedly around the world. It's more than just taking food to communities and making sure that the prices of food for vulnerable people. It's something that actually, as a human population, Marcus Rashford has done something amazing, and making sure that there's something there in the UK for kids who've been left out by the COVID pandemic. So, I mean, but that's been a reaction to poverty and a reaction to, the need to get food to some communities very quickly and very immediately. How do we scale that out, do you think, Chris?
I mean, I think what it has done is really focused attention that this isn't just an issue that happens thousands of kilometres away. It can happen just a few metres down the road in the most developed countries as well as the poorest countries. But what excites me about food, and why I started to take that sidestep from pure urban design to a food-based urban design, is the fact that it's low threshold. Everybody can join the food system at wherever is comfortable for their skills. And you saw recently in the budget in the UK, the focus on wanting to move towards a more skilled economy. And if you look at this desire for local food chains, local growing, it can be low tech, it can be high tech, and it affects everybody from suppliers to purchasers to growers to the tech and the data behind all of this. So I think moving forwards, we need to keep that momentum, but take it away from just a kind of a very quick, we need to get the meals on the table approach to where's that meal coming from in the broadest sense. Are we growing it here? Are we avoiding it being wasted here? Where are we importing it from? And how do we tighten that all up and make it more exciting? I mean, you see high streets in the UK have really become sort of food streets. Shops are disappearing at a rate as fast as pubs. And where is that food coming from? It's all being imported. I looked at a stat the other day that the average annual food cost for a UK household is around £5,000 a year, based on a 2.4 household, which means a town of 15,000 people spends around £30 million a year on food. Now, if all of that is coming from somewhere else, that money is not staying in the local economy, not generating in the local economy, not supporting local jobs. So I think there's an awful lot of opportunities to build on that momentum about food insecurity in cities. How is the regeneration going to look in the future? What are we going to do with empty stock buildings? And can we not make it more sensible?
It makes Catherine, Katrina, you're nodding your head violently. So is that something that you would agree with? Is it something that you're seeing in the research that you do?
Yeah, that's something I would agree with wholeheartedly. And the problem is with globalisation, then how much of that actually gets back to the farmer in terms of having, produced by ethical means. so local supply chains is an area that we have to focus on, as Chris highly mentioned, to keep some of the returns of the money in our own economies and not going out elsewhere. That's, for economic growth. What's also being done is, changes in innovation. I think in the beginning, we were all very scared about robotics costing us all our jobs. But without robotics in times of COVID, that's where bottlenecks came in some of the supply chains, because harvesting couldn't be performed by hand pickers. So that was a big problem.
Richard, maybe I'll bring you in here, because you're the person that can help us understand a little bit from a practical perspective how all of this works. So where does the financial system need to get involved? Where do we find, how do we support the SMEs to innovate like this? How do we make sure that communities and literally ecosystems develop around food? What's your experience in drink, and what's your experience in all of this and the role of innovation?
Well, I can speak to this from a few different points of view. So you've mentioned some macro trends there worldwide. Let me give you a very localized example that might make it quite real for everyone on the call. If you go down to your local multiple retailer, Sainsbury's, Tesco, whatever the case may be, I can tell you for sure right now that they're experiencing some real shortages in the cheaper end of fruit juice. So there's a very small example, because someone with more disposable income can still go down and buy Tropicana, but the supply chain at the lower end of the market, where you're moving down from maybe 250 a litre down to 70 or 80p, so the entry level for families that may struggle a little bit more, that's just not on shelf at the moment. And I know that because they've been calling saying, can you help us find some product? And of course, the disruptive situations that we're experiencing at the moment, the movement of lower cost labour due to COVID, the shipping issues, they're all blocking those goods from coming in. And that's perhaps an example that just shows it is around the corner, no matter what product it may be, no matter how big the retailer, and very much in first world countries as well. This isn't just an issue that's limited to third world countries or very minimal supply chains. The big players are struggling too. In terms of barriers to entry from the SME perspective, I think that's worth a mention here. I'm a drinks guy, so my field of vision is perhaps much more narrow than the other people that you've got on there, who are very obviously specialists in this topic. My specialist area is the development and marketing of drinks products, typically innovative drinks products using functional ingredients. Every time we come to market, we're looking at what's the right packaging format for a particular product. Every time we face a similar list of choices, you've got cans, which the marketing would lead you to believe are infinitely recyclable without looking at the energy cost of doing so, or the likelihood of participation by the public in getting those back to be recycled. We're badly in need of a deposit scheme like they have in Germany, where there's a deposit paid on each product, and that's credited back when you take it back to the retailer. The retailer, I think, needs to step in and help solve the issue. We've obviously got plastic, or PET as it's called in the industry. We all know the problems there. It is in most cases recyclable, but again, collection is an issue, and it's the, I guess, media darling in terms of being washed up on beaches internationally. So that's very much a problem. Then you've got Tetra Pak. Now, Tetra Pak or similar operate in a closed ecosystem of Tetra Pak filling machines that are very expensive to buy. That means there are very few fillers. So if I go to market with a new product, or I often get calls from entrepreneurs, I'm thinking of launching a drink, I've just come out of university, you did it, can you talk me through it? And we always get into a question around, well, okay, what pack format do you want to use? If you go with cans, the minimum order quantities are probably 10 times larger than if you go with plastic. If you go with Tetra Pak, the same is true, and it's hard to secure a slot with a contract manufacturer to actually fill the product. So guess where most brands go? They go into plastic. Then you get to the retailer, and the retailer says, we're trying to trim the amount of plastic that we have in store. You look along the shelf to fact check that, and you've got the international mega brands taking up 90% of the shelf with a whole lot of plastic. So as a percentage, how do they drop the percentage of plastic on the drink shelf? They push it onto the very smallest brands. Sorry, we're not taking any more brands in plastic, rather than pushing Coca-Cola, Pepsi, the big water brands to move away. And huge volume of product, aside from the branded goods, moves through in the very cheapest formats, the very cheapest bottled waters and things like that. Plastic is cheaper, unfortunately, so it proliferates. So there are some real challenges coming through from an SME side. The challenge begins with the packaging, and then I could speak endlessly about the ingredients and everything as well. I mean, here I think we're keeping it quite broad, quite macro level. There are whole conferences around sustainable packaging, sustainable ingredients, supply chains. We could probably burn this hour very easily with me going on about those. So I'll stop now and do just ask me anything more specific that you might want to know.
So I think, I mean, this has actually brought two sides together, because I mean, what Chris is saying is this is a circular economy issue, and we've talked about the food, the ingredients, we've talked about the bigger sort of geoeconomic situation and the issue of sustainability and, you know, feeding large scale populations, giving them enough liquid, enough food in a sustainable way. But I guess what you're doing is you're saying, well, it's also about distribution. It's also about, it's not about the supply chain as such. And this is one of the things that came out of our sessions yesterday. It's not about the supply chain, it's about the value chain, which is, you know, you start with an idea, you go right the way through that whole thing to the end where it ends up in your recycling bin. It's a circular economy, and how do we make sure that that is built into everything that we do? It becomes a very difficult issue for the planet. I don't know, Chris, have you got what's your thinking around that? You're our circular economy expert.
No, I mean, you do see that there's an increased trend for deposit return schemes. I know that Richard just mentioned that, you know, in Germany, the Netherlands, a lot of countries now, you know, deposit return is a big part of the way that you do your grocery shopping. And I think also the trend that you saw during COVID of home deliveries can make that, can help that to scale up and scale out. I mean, if you're getting your stuff delivered, then for the person who's delivering, then it makes logistical sense to not run empty, you know, so that they collect your empties after they deliver the new goods. If you don't want to be driving back to your warehouse with an empty van, if you can help it, if you can be taking some packaging back that's going to be reused, then I think that makes sense in terms of convenience for the customer, and perhaps also in terms of a business model for the distribution company for home deliveries. So I think that's an area where there is great potential. And you see also that some of the big coffee houses like Starbucks and Costa are moving towards reusable cup schemes as well. Again, on the back of big data and blockchain, and being able to track and trace the, to use that terrible phrase, the products that are in circulation, to make sure that they keep in circulation. So I think there are some movements that are going to make that reusable packaging more convenient for the customer. And I'm curious if, Richard, if you think that would also help open up the options of packaging for, like you say, the smaller scale producer.
I think the issue there, Chris, is that for the smaller scale producer, there's still the value chain issue, because all the retailers obviously exert great pressure on pricing. There's also an upper limit in terms of what a consumer will pay on the shelf, or should pay, frankly, for different products. When you compare the UK retail scene to the Europeans, the margins enjoyed by our multiple retailers are significantly larger, whilst the business is ostensibly very similar. So profit is the only reason for that. I think until there's a little bit of relaxation in the margin expectation from the retailer, it becomes very difficult for brands at an early stage to take the financial hit of using the more sustainable packaging. And part of it is consumer willingness as well to recognize that, and perhaps be willing to pay slightly more. Katrina mentioned that people are perhaps spending too little as a percentage of their income on food. and perhaps living beyond their means just as a society in terms of spending highly on, I don't know, entertainment, vehicles, whatever else might be, rather than prioritizing food and beverage at the top of their spending pattern. So I think that's an issue as well. We've all got to recognize the true value. I'm sure you guys have got a lot more stats than me, but I've seen some very interesting stuff around the true value of all food production, and it usually doesn't reflect what we see on the shelf. I'm talking about basics like fruit and vegetables, meats. If we actually had to produce those domestically, the value chain would just throw out a far different retail price to the one that's enjoyed at the moment.
Well, certainly, I mean, I let Katrina come in because she's the expert on all of this. But I mean, one thing I would say is when I look at trade statistics, you look at how much we import of our food supply chain compared to how much of it we export. You know, we're importing well over 50% of our food supply chain. So I mean, it really food and drink, it's absolutely massive. So we are dependent on that trade, which ultimately makes everything unsustainable, because what it does is exactly what you're talking about, Richard, which is it pushes prices down. It means that then there's a squeeze, and this is something that I'm particularly interested in that you've said is it's putting a squeeze actually on those cheaper brands, which are less sustainable, but also more vulnerable in terms of the global food supply chain, because you know, they're coming in from abroad. The cheaper things are mass produced in other markets. And Katrina, this is something we've been seeing for a long time. I mean, you listen to the food programme on Radio 4 or whatever, and you're listening to farmers in this country who've been complaining about food pricing in supermarkets for a very long time. I mean, that's not something new. A lot of these issues have been around for donkey's years, haven't they?
Yeah, for sure. The agricultural sector really manages uncertainty every single year. But what we've seen in 2020 really tested the whole seasoned individuals and professionals. The COVID-19 disrupted the supply chain in many ways, and it reduced, and in some cases then, the demand for ethanol, particularly from corn, and for other reasons, it nearly collapsed dining away from home. And it closed many processing plants in terms of meat production and other production systems. And these types of disruptions reduced prices significantly for some of the world's biggest crops, including corn, soy, and sugarcane. And when prices drop, growers spend less on seed, equipment, and chemicals, creating a whole ripple effect of disruption right through the entire chain. And the growers, the protein producers, and the businesses that depend on them will need to pay close attention to signposts that indicate the direction prices might take, including these crop yields and feed consumption in major markets and things. You know, so that whole down valuing the food chain really has to be considered. And you know, if we as a nation have to rely on imports 50%, it's quoted that our supermarkets will only last about 3 to 4 weeks before they will have no food on the shelf if those particular imports go away. Now, what we have also seen in supermarket shelves here in Northern Ireland is it's very difficult to get bottled water, and small bottles of water that used to come in packs of 12. And of course, with Northern Ireland, we're sometimes asking, is this Brexit related, or is this related more to what happened with COVID? So there are a number of factors that have to be taken into play and different policies that need to be considered. And, you know, when you sort of think about an enterprise needing to change its supply chain, it's estimated that it can take somewhere up to 3 years to reduce those vulnerabilities and supply chain disruptions. That can be a long time. So finding immediate solutions isn't easy, but it really has to be thought about now for the future, not to let it become our children's problem and our grandchildren's problem. We need, like climate change, we need to start thinking about it now.
Just on that, there's a really interesting question coming in now on urban agriculture. So I mean, I remember teaching my students a long time ago when I was teaching economics as economics to undergraduates, and I remember saying to them, we have a huge problem because, and this is in the mid-90s, we have a huge problem because we've suddenly realized that we can have strawberries at Christmas. Now, under no circumstances is strawberries at Christmas something that we've ever thought was possible, but now it's kind of the norm. You make strawberry cheesecakes at Christmas. So, I mean, there's an expectation of products being available around the year, which is in itself creating issues. And as we shorten supply chains, of course, and make them more local, we're going to lose that element of variability and, you know, availability at Christmas. So is urban agriculture and is sort of, I don't know, vertical farming or whatever, is that something that's possible as a way of solving all of this? Chris, you must have ideas around that in terms of design as well, food design.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the realm of urban agriculture, if you think of sort of the vertical farming, has really been focused on the microgreens, leafy greens, and your salads and stuff. But there's not a lot of appetite for the soft fruits, and strawberries is a big focus area at the moment with the urban farming. And, you know, there's an awful lot that's possible. And also in the northern Nordics, they're looking at tropical fruit production in controlled environment agriculture. And yeah, I mean, technically, probably a lot of this can happen, but you have to balance that against energy costs. And energy is one of the big challenges for controlled environment agriculture and urban farming. And so also in the Netherlands in the last couple of weeks, huge price increases in gas, and I think also in the UK as well. And a lot of these greenhouses, which are heated predominantly by gas, I mean, they've got long-term subsidized rates, but they still had crisis meetings about how is this going to affect our business strategy going forwards? Because, you know, there also that was a big impact on the margins. And so I think a big challenge for urban ag is energy, but I think it can also play a very important role in food waste avoidance. And I'm working on a strategy for it with a very small scale operation in the south of the Republic of Ireland, and looking at the microgreens and the herbs production as a source of income, selling the ingredients, but also as a source of ingredients to help him process and add value to other perishable products that isn't sold before it would expire. So in that sense, I think it has an important role to play in the food waste avoidance and adding value to foods close to the point where it would otherwise be wasted. So I think urban agriculture has a really good role to play, but you have to be very careful how you do it, what you do it, and really pay attention to the energy aspect.
Richard, I would say those are all really good points, but in the end, what are we doing this for? So the issue around urban agriculture, what is it ever going to be able to solve our huge sort of distribution problems? Is it a micro problem that, you know, literally brings everything very close to home, but actually has huge barriers to entry, perhaps because of energy costs or its scalability? Richard, what would you say around that? Is it something that you encounter?
Well, in terms of urban agriculture, I'm not sure I'm best qualified by a long margin on this panel to speak to that. My personal thoughts on that would be eating seasonally seemed to work very well decades ago. So perhaps there's a message there to be taken. But urban agriculture is to speak to you on that would be would be incorrect. Really, I'm not a specialist in that area. It doesn't really interplay too much with the beverage sector, so I don't want to get involved where it's not my topic there.
But maybe there's something, a broader point that I'm trying to make, and maybe it's Chris, Katrina as well on this. It's that if we try and bring production systems closer to home, and if we try to, you know, there's sort of the whole sort of agenda around food is, you know, small is beautiful, and, you know, making everything as micro as we can, we're creating bigger problems in terms of access across the globe, aren't we? So we're creating, and then we're creating problems of the scalability for the sector. So the type of things that you do distributing across the world becomes more difficult because we focus this on local communities and we haven't then grown the infrastructure, so to speak. So it's actually what I'm beginning to take out of this conversation, which I'm sure we all knew before we came in, is that this is like an engine, and if you tweak one bit of it, then you're having an effect on something else, and it makes the other bit of it not quite work as well as it did before. So what do we do about that fundamental problem?
Well, Katrina mentioned there's a shortage, for example, of even such simple goods as bottled waters, and that is down both to Brexit and to the shipping disruptions. But it also comes back to the economic issue, and that's kind of where I've taken most of the discussion. I do realise that, but it seems to be the largest driver. Frankly, the margins on those products are so low that after a time of very, very quiet production, sometimes non-existent production in some of the plants during the worst of COVID across Europe, they're catching up on high margin items, quite frankly. They're doing big long runs of high margin items rather than very small pressured margins for UK retail. It's as simple as that, frankly. They'll catch up on those when they can. And that's a situation that's been engineered by the margin expectations, once again, of UK big retail. They push so hard. It's another of the problems that retailers have actually spoken to us about. Can we help solve it? And you might be surprised that when you speak to some of the European manufacturers, you would think that it would be exciting to them to perhaps supply Tesco or Sainsbury or Asda. They're actually not too interested. They aren't interested in a model that could send 60, 70, 80% of their volume to one customer that will then push them on price. They see it as a short win and a quick route out of business, frankly, when they've declined all of the other volume that they could take on those lines.
So is it specifically a UK problem, this price race to the bottom in terms of prices?
It's not specific to the UK, but I think it's one of the worst examples around. I think those margin expectations that I spoke to earlier in terms of UK retail as a percentage versus European retailers, it's a stark difference. You know, I'm talking 40s and 50% expectation here in the UK versus maybe mid-20s across in Europe. That's a massive difference. Some of it could go to the consumer, and it's a big difference to brands and the supply chain as well. If you draw out a value chain, it's very clear where the majority is being hoovered up, and the supply chain does react to that when times are tighter. They say, okay, well, we know where we get least from. They're at the back of the queue. It's as simple as that.
Katrina, I think Richard's answering your questions around it being a Brexit and a UK specific problem. I think that. But how do we address this? I mean, if the UK has a specific problem around this, how can we design our food security? You know, is it an issue of national security? Actually, is it something that we need to focus on and think of as part of our whole issue around national security, particularly in a post-Brexit world?
I don't know if we've got the agricultural square miles that we perhaps had a few decades ago. Again, one of the other participants might have some better stats on that, but I think a lot of what was farming land is no longer. So,
no, I think a part of it is also what do you grow and what do you want to eat. I mean, there's plenty of land available still, but what are you growing? I mean, I don't see in the UK so many huge expanses of greenhouse production like you have in the Netherlands, but that's also, I think it's lobbied against in many places, and the council for, you know, people want to have their open landscape views and not the high intensity production. So I think probably you could increase production hugely. I don't have stats on that, but what I observe from a distance, I'm not in the UK these days, is that there's probably still plenty of land around, but how is it being used and what's it being farmed for?
So I think Chris has touched on, you know, what we need and what we'd like might be two different things. And when we look to urbanisation, you know, in my view, when we look to urbanisation, it's because the population is going to be so big by 2050 that 30% of the land that we have now will probably be taken projects or housing developments, just to let the people live. You know, and a lot of attention then moved to aquaculture as protein supply systems. And of course, with aquaculture, Europe in total has declined in terms of its aquaculture production, but Asia has gone up significantly. over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. So that's another area that needs to be thought about. But the urbanization area in terms of design, we have so many derelict buildings in our city centres that could be used for that purpose. And with the right subsidies to get off and going and developed, could be beneficial, both for governments and the commercial world.
Yeah.
There's also another area that Chris touched on in terms of local foods. And, I'm not sure if you pay much attention to Mary Berry, but there's another cookbook out looking at how to produce food dishes from local ingredients without needing all the spices of the world and everything else to make it much more affordable cooking. So, we have to look at the sector in totality and what we want, what we need, and, make sure they line up.
So, I mean, just in terms of the public discourse, then, how much responsibility do programmes like, Mary Berry and Bake Off and MasterChef have in, I mean, they've popularised food, absolutely no question about it, but how much responsibility do they have in actually making it obvious to people that there are simple local sources of food, and that they can grow their own chilies on their windowsills, or their own spices, or their own herbs, or their own tomatoes on a cane outside the kitchen window. How much responsibility does that type of solution have, that type of media outlet?
I think it's really important in terms, we were talking about availability of land, and if you see globally how much land is used to grow crops to feed animals and how much it is used by animals for grazing, and I mean, I'm not a vegetarian myself, but I don't eat huge amounts of meat. But if we were, that's one of the reasons that Project Drawdown identified sort of food waste and transitioning towards a more plant-rich diet as being so effective in the toolbox for tackling climate change, is that enormous swathes of land that are used to grow food to feed an animal, then to feed ourselves. So it's land use efficiency is really important in this discussion, and changing mindsets about what's an aspirational meal. I think that's a role that is very important for TV cooking as well. And to make the climate responsible alternative really appealing. It's not just a load of boiled beans. It can be a really inspiring dish on the table, and I think that's something that could get a lot more focus than it does currently.
There's a question, sorry to interrupt, there's a question coming through which is really relevant to this, and there's been this move towards veganism, and there's been vegetarianism for sustainability reasons, but can you actually reduce the environmental impact of meat production itself? I mean, is that something we can do? What's your view of sort of insect protein? I mean, or versus grown meat, for example. I mean, one of the things that I would say about insect protein is that we're not seeing as many insects because of the use of pesticides on the landscape. So maybe we have to be a bit modest about that one. But what grown meat, is it a sustainable solution, or is it something that we can develop?
Well, I'll pick up on that one. Certainly from the food and beverage sector itself, there is a huge focus to just answer the kind of broad principle of Michael's question. Yes, it is a big conversation. Absolutely. I see there's an addendum to the question there mentioning insect protein to feed animals. I've certainly seen that coming through in some pet care brands. It's a very hot trend at the moment, and it can probably be put out more widely beyond pets. Into other areas of animal feed. But I think there's a future there in terms of feeding a human population as well. Chris mentioned the kind of land and intensity cost of producing a given quantity of meat in the traditional way. And I think you've got to break it down that in the human diet, you've got 3 macronutrients: proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Proteins have traditionally come from meat. So now we've got to explore the way to fulfill the needs of an ever-expanding population. Some would say an overpopulation of the world, but that's a controversial topic that could probably fill another hour or two of debate. We've got to look at ways of fulfilling that need for protein, which is the most intense energy cost of all of those three macronutrients. And I personally think that there is a future for insect. I know it got a chuckle from Katrina, and it does tend to when it's brought up. I think it's going to take a lot of PR, a lot of marketing, and it might never break through in our lifetimes in the Western world. But if we're talking on a global basis, we know it's much more acceptable in the Eastern markets. We know that already. So there's certainly an ability for that to fulfill a large percentage of the requirement for protein. It's about then marketing the right product, getting it to taste good, getting the texture acceptable. And that's all the kind of the business of SMEs, I guess, for a start. And that will in time pick up with the bigger players, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think in the end, that it's something that can be achieved in quite an intense and compact way as well. So if you're talking about the reuse of the old industrial heritage in the UK, some of the big factories, perhaps that's also an area that we can explore for repurposing. And you know, they're not always the most ideal buildings for other types of urban food production, but mushrooms and insects is perhaps an interesting way to look.
Yeah, the cost right now of insect protein is quite high. Yeah. Because it's kind of a trendy new protein. As that happens at bigger scale, there's potential for the cost to become extremely accessible globally. And I think I think that's one of the reasons it's got a real future, as well as the environmental impact too. Alternatively, we've got to switch more and more towards the Flexitarian approach. I know Chris mentioned it. That's something I do as well. And it's not really a conscious decision to eat less meat. It is, as Chris said, as the menu for vegetarian or vegan options and plant-based diet has become much more interesting. So it's kind of driven by the supply side rather than by an ethical or environmental push. And I think that is when you combine, as Katrina mentioned, what people want versus what we need. If you deliver things that people might want, we can help get to what we all need as a global society.
I think it's, you know, the insect world resonates with aquaculture. You know, there's a lot of people don't eat aquaculture fish because it looks like a fish, and it looks like an animal. And it's the same then with insects. If insects look like insects, people may not buy into the eating of them, but things like flour, insect flour and other products, processed products, might go down a lot better in terms of consumer attitudes and behaviors. And I think it is just rebalancing the consumer in terms of, you know, taste, quality, and what they're eating. But other things we would have to think about, you know, along with the insects is, you know, are there potential concerns around food safety? Or are there potential concerns around allergens in particular? Because these are different proteins that people haven't ate in any shape or form until the last number of years in sort of commercialized diets. They may have ate them, but not in the same commercial scales.
Would that apply to lab-grown meat as well? There's a question here on lab-grown meat. The idea seems to be slowly on the rise. Might this become a main source of meat, or is that actually something that has too many challenges around food security, for example, toxins, allergens?
I think a lot of that will come down to cost risk-benefit analysis in terms of the economics. You know, the production in the lab hasn't got to the stage where it would be cost efficient, as far as I'm aware. But as it approaches that sort of scale up, you know, it might be. And again, it comes down to consumer perception. You know, a lot of people don't necessarily look at meat in the supermarket shelf and think that comes from a cow, a pig, or a sheep. They just see it as a slab of meat. So it's getting them to sort of acceptability. And I think if it's grown in the lab and the taste and the quality is just as good, you know, and there are no safety issues, it might be taken up quicker. but there's still a long way to go there, I think, before we get any sort of acceptability, because we're still having issues around genetically modified organisms, the use of those in certain regions of the world. And although we've moved to synthetic biology and CRISPR as new terms, which are more acceptable than genetically modified organisms, there's still safety concerns out there. And we must be into, what, 30, 35 years of genetically modified organisms.
Huge scope for innovation around all of this, and you're right, the genetically modified foods and sort of monster cabbages or whatever, that's not taken off in the way that people might have expected it to 20 years ago. Why is that? Is it because people felt that they would have Frankenstein foods, or is it because just the risks associated with it in terms of the innovation and the development were too great? Because I mean, sort of things like rice enhanced with vitamins is actually a good idea. So what's happened around that agenda?
I think in relation to that agenda, there's been a little bit more acceptance of genetically modified organisms. A lot of the hype at the beginning was media driven. I think, there's still work being done across different consumers in terms of acceptability. And I think there are still some major concerns that it might not necessarily affect you as the primary consumer, but different generations as they're born and develop, because we don't know enough yet in terms of genetically modified organisms, in terms of what perhaps generational effects they might have, if any. I have to add as well, if it's a choice between starvation in some parts of the world and having a genetically modified crop, I'm sure they would prefer the genetically modified crop, especially if it's got vitamins as its modification.
I think as a general kind of observation of where does the bulk of sale goes to, it goes to people who can, it goes to the very affordable end of food that's available for sale, and people are buying it whether because it tastes nice and it's cheap. They don't really care what it is. I mean, if people cared what was in a sausage, they probably wouldn't eat it, but most people know what goes in a sausage and they still eat it anyway because it tastes nice. So I think that whole argument, it plays out at a certain level in the media, but the mass consumption in public, it's just, can I afford it and is it tasty? And the rest of it, what it is, people don't know and they don't care.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's true. Yeah.
Richard, you look like you wanted to come in on that.
No, I was just nodding actually, but I agree. Yes, I do agree, especially with the sausage analogy. You look down at a sausage on the plate and consider what's gone in there, then I think you would just throw it out, wouldn't you? Yet nonetheless, it's a very popular dish. And I think the same could be said about any of those things that we've mentioned: insects, lab-grown meat, in time, and perhaps driven by necessity, will no doubt become more acceptable. And then generationally, people will think less about them. Personally, on the non-GMO topic, it's one I see a lot in the ingredient supply chain. And my first question is, well, how many generations back are you going to say it's non-GMO? Because you can measure a couple of generations and say something is non-GMO. A lot of the crops, when you get further back, start to be GMO. So I think there could be a standardization around that claim if you're going to make it across the food and beverage industry. Otherwise, it's kind of meaningless / misleading, in my opinion.
And that brings me to a very nice point, actually. We're beginning to run out of time, but which is unfortunate because I have a feeling like we could carry on talking about this forever, but because it's a big problem. But you've talked about standardization there, Richard, and within the sector that we operate in and the context of this event, the issue around standardization applies to technology. It applies to how we measure ESG standards so that we can finance them properly. It applies to, obviously quality control across the different supply chains, just from a manufacturing or a services point of view. It applies to absolutely everything. but my question from that is, if we can develop global standards, what are they? And for sustainability in our food supply chains, what are they? And then what is the role of the financial services sector in getting us to that point where we can genuinely say that our supply chains have become sustainable?
That's probably a topic in itself.
Exactly. Well, no, there's no harm in going global with these questions. So there's a question here, which is that some large brands are patenting everyday seed types that millions rely on. What can be done around that?
I guess that's a legislative challenge, isn't it? I mean, in the food and beverage world, in terms of branded goods, it can often be difficult to patent things. Recipes and stuff are more protected by secrecy than anything else, because when you patent things in a lot of jurisdictions, patenting a recipe is seen as limiting the commercial application of the constituent parts. So I guess they could have some drilling down and examination as to whether they could protect that under a similar basis, that these patents are limiting commercial application too widely. Maybe enforce more specifics around exactly why the patent is justified. But then again, commercially, on the other hand, these organizations have presumably done some work to develop these, and I don't know a lot about them specifically, but these types of seeds. So one would argue that if the potential to protect that work was taken away, would the work even be carried out? So you've got to incentivize the commercial marketplace as well at the same time. So that's a pretty tough balance. I'm pleased I don't have to solve that problem personally.
So I'm going to ask each of you now, in the couple of minutes that remain, just to summarize what you think the key next step should be. What are we going to be talking about in 12 months' time, and how do we get there? Katrina, I'll start with you.
I think what we have to do is look across our SME sector and see what innovations are coming through related to food and agriculture and aquaculture, and see how they can be promoted and supported and further developed to have, worldly products that, will help meet some of these challenges. I think academia can do a lot of talking, but you need the innovation to actually drive forward the change, and also to boost the economy if it's SMEs.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I think innovation is one thing. Facilitation is another one. Making sure that working together with local councils and local businesses to help understand what is your food system ecosystem. Who are the operators? Who are the people that want to do stuff? What empty stock do you have? What land do you have? And how can you best put that together to be a really useful, beneficial package for local economies, and seeing local authorities as facilitators in getting that going? Because often there's a lot of good ideas, but you need those ideas to find each other, and you need an enabler to help take them to market and to also allow them to happen.
Richard, SMEs and facilitation, what do you think?
I think, first of all, continue to educate the consumer about the true cost in the supply chain, both environmentally and financially, so that there's a bit more wide appreciation of the true value of the things that people are consuming. I think as well, facilitating that innovation financially. There's a perception that there's a lot of investment washing around. There is, but at the same time, it's still relatively risk averse. If we want big innovative changes, investment groups need to take risks earlier and properly resource early stage ideas that might seem a bit wacky, and they're going to have to take a few risks and probably back a few bad businesses in there. But they're going to need to take those risks if we're going to move things exponentially forward. Otherwise, we'll continue in the similar model that we're in now. If that's what people want to do, great. If you want to change it, then you've got to change some behaviors there as well to get a different outcome.
What can I say? Three really excellent contributions, and thank you so much for this session. It's been absolutely brilliant. And to the group of people listening, I speak on behalf of everybody. Some great questions coming through, some challenging questions as well. It's been absolutely marvellous and a real privilege to speak to all three of you. And thank you very, very much indeed. Just to everybody listening, the next session starts at 2 o'clock. And we will be talking about how digital technologies can actually help the sustainability agenda. Very much look forward to speaking to everyone at 2 o'clock again. Katrina, Chris, Richard, huge privilege. Thank you very much indeed for your time and your contribution, and hope to speak again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.